everyone, and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. I want to begin today by talking about episodes other than this one. Specifically, I am aware of the fact that there are many video games that people play in probably larger numbers than read specialized scholarship on Byzantium that feature Byzantium. And many of you write to me and you tell me about these, and I'm definitely interested. I'm not a gamer, but it's an aspect of the representation of Byzantium that is very important. I think it's not very well understood, and yet it's responsible for bringing a lot of students to our classrooms, I think, or so they say. And so I am looking for someone who can speak about that issue. So, hold tight. Or maybe not. I don't know. It might take a while because experts on Byzantium and video game players are, maybe that group doesn't overlap that much, but I'm trying. Another matter, I also do have quite a few questions left over from the listener questions that I asked you to send me, and I've structured those into thematically related episodes, and we're going to be recording those still. I know it's been a while. This is taking longer than I expected, but that's what happens when you have a release date every 2 weeks. So it'll be a while, but I will get around to most of your questions, so have no fear about that. And also, just looking ahead, a couple months ahead, hopefully less, I'm planning a special episode for you with horror stories from Byzantium, and that should be fun. I'm liking already the way it's shaping up. Anyway, so that's just some notes about future episodes and some ideas that I have. I just wanted to respond to those of you who are writing to me, especially about the video games. I'll look into it. So our episode today, it combines a number of different areas and interests, and what holds them together is my worry about how we're studying Byzantine literature and how we're talking about it. And I'm hoping to develop a number of episodes about this topic as well. And my worry is the following, that after a very long period during which Byzantine literature was disparaged, even by experts in it, it was almost a kind of requirement that if you're an expert in Byzantine literature, you have to constantly put it down and talk about how the prose is flat and the poetry is like prose. And it's just like, it's unreal. Poor me, I have to read this stuff, and, here's some jokes about how bad it is and all that. That lasted for well into the 20th century, into the late 20th century. And we've stopped doing that now, fortunately, but the field hasn't yet developed a mechanism or vehicle or a set of ideas or even promotional tactics by which to explain to the world at large why Byzantine literature is worth reading, and even less so, why it's fun to read. And I suspect that part of the reason is that a lot of us experts also don't find it fun to read or really enjoy it, or can even really articulate why we think it's important above and beyond the historical data that it provides to us as historians. Now, I should say that for myself, I really enjoy reading Byzantine literature much more than I enjoy reading modern literature, especially the modern novel. But that's maybe a topic for a different time. The question of Byzantine literature is a very complex one. It involves a number of different areas of research, and I wanted this episode to touch on as many of them as possible. Specifically, I mean, we have on the one hand the manuscripts in which Byzantine texts are preserved, and what we're doing with those manuscripts, especially now that a lot of them have been digitized and made available online. There are also the digital versions of Byzantine texts, especially the TLG, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, which is an online database of digitized Byzantine texts, which has a number of very useful tools for doing all kinds of fascinating things. And then there's just the experience of just sitting down and reading a text and waiting for it to deliver its surprises. I find Byzantine texts are often very surprising. I find them often, if it's a master stylist, they're very well crafted. They make you think. They force you to think about what's going on and what is being hinted at above and beyond what's explicitly said. This is something that Byzantines really, really enjoyed doing themselves and to each other and to us at over this great distance of time. So to talk with me about all of these topics, we touch on all of these a little bit, is my guest today, Dave Jenkins, who is a librarian at Princeton University, and his areas are classics, linguistics, and Hellenic studies. I've known him for quite a while, and he's also someone like me who really enjoys reading Byzantine texts. And I thought it would be fun to talk with him generally about how we came to reading Byzantine literature and what we do with online resources, and he's a pioneer in that regard, and what is it that we enjoy when we read these texts. And he's an ideal person for this because he's a reader of Byzantine texts. He is a philosopher. He writes, if you want to go technical, he writes some pretty technical stuff about Apulos and Proclus and Neoplatonism and their ideas. But he's also on the library science side of things and works with students in classics and Byzantine studies. So he's just a very all-around guy, fascinating and fun to talk to. And I thought he'd be an ideal person to start off what I hope will be a series of conversations on Byzantine literature and its virtues. So here then is my discussion with Dave Jenkins. Dave Jenkins, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I can't really figure out why, but I guess we'll find out.
You sort of stumbled into it. I think you wrote me an email or something, and that's enough.
Okay, all right, that's all it takes, huh?
Yeah, I wrote people, and I said, by the way, you want to? Anyway, I don't remember that.
Because I think that if nothing else, my kids, I think, are going to be greatly amused by this. They're great listeners of podcasts. I think they get most of their information, in fact, from podcasts. And they got me into it a bit. I started listening to Joe Rogan, but of course I caught so much grief for doing so that I had to I had to give it up. But I do occasionally listen to, comedians who do podcasts. So I don't know how funny this is going to be, but that's generally what I think of when I think of a podcast.
Okay. It's up to you how funny we are and how wholesome you are,
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So you are an area studies librarian
Yes.
at Princeton University. You're responsible for classics, Hellenic studies, and
Linguistics.
Exactly. That's right. But you're also a Byzantinist, and I know you as a Byzantinist, and you've done brilliant work on Michael Psellos. And I remember we had met back when you were at Notre Dame, and I thought you were just a Psellos person, but you're wearing these two hats. So let's get from one to the other, and we'll start with the library side. But first, so you described yourself to me as an accidental Byzantinist, and I thought this would be interesting to talk about. What brought you to Byzantium of all things? Or to rephrase the question, what brought you to Byzantium?
Yeah, well, I figured that everybody who's a Byzantinist is in some sense accidental. I mean, it's not like I met anybody in high school who said, I want to grow up to be a Byzantinist. I mean, I grew up in Minnesota, and which might explain that. I mean, I'd never even, considered this line of work as really a possibility. But my entry really to the field is, I think, remarkably accidental. I was an undergraduate major in classics, and then I went to Harvard Divinity School, where I eventually earned a master's of theological studies. But in typical Div School fashion, I accomplished that without taking a single course in theology. So what does a master of theological studies with no theological training, what is the next step for that person? So I thought, well, my best option is probably to find work in the Harvard library system, which I did. I bounced around for a few years, but I ended up at the Harvard Law School Library in its special collections as the stack supervisor. So this was a fantastic job for someone like me. I worked in a temperature-controlled, high-security vault, surrounded by thousands of volumes, dedicated to basically early modern law. And most of these were from the European continent. So it was the civil law tradition, as opposed, of course, to the common law tradition that the UK and the US are a part of. And civil law is based on Roman law, but also specifically on a particular codification of Roman law, which occurred in the 6th century under the aegis of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. And so it's in that context that I sort of first became aware of something specifically Byzantine, but that's really all I really knew. Now, I had always been very precocious about languages, so I had kept up with, Latin and Greek and European languages. And so, I was generally in tune to the basic idea. So I worked at that job for 10 years. And towards the end, I eventually got a master's of library science from Simmons College. I got married, started to have a family. So I started to look for professional work. And I had a couple options within the Harvard system, but at that time, a strange posting came from Notre Dame. They were looking for a specifically Byzantine studies librarian. Now, they were looking for someone with 5 years of professional experience, a very specific skill set, which I didn't have. But I thought, well, I probably have enough Greek and I have enough of the languages to just throw an application at it. So I did. And of course, long story short, I'm hired and I find myself in South Bend, Indiana as the Byzantine Studies librarian. So it does seem very accidental that someone becomes more or less a professional Byzantinist 2 months after realizing that a Byzantinist is something you could be, so I feel very fortunate in that sense. So the question is, well, why did Notre Dame want a specifically Byzantine studies librarian? And the answer is that they had acquired a very unique personal library from a very famous American Byzantinist, Milton Anastas, who taught for many years at UCLA. And what's interesting, Anthony, I mean, you obviously have a scholarly library. Do you have any idea how many volumes you have? I mean,
no
notion at all. You don't have a personal card catalog or?
No, I have a Word document where I have entered the bibliographical information for all of my books.
Yeah.
So that I can retrieve them and cut and paste them into footnotes or bibliographies when I need to.
Sure.
But I haven't counted them.
Yeah, because the reason I ask is that I think a pretty healthy scholarly personal library is probably in the range of 5,000 volumes, somewhere in that neighborhood. Milton's personal library was somewhere in the neighborhood of 40,000 volumes.
Wow.
So this is a single individual who basically collected all of Byzantine scholarship. I mean, so that an institution who purchased that library became almost immediately a center for Byzantine studies, which in fact, I think was the aspiration of Notre Dame at the time. So for the first 3 or 4 years of that job, my job was basically just to integrate this collection, which was stored in a variety of areas across campus, into the holdings of the library. And I sort of, became familiar with the field just in this very intense bibliographic way of integrating that library. And then my, position took on other aspects as well, but it was primarily in that context. So I worked at Notre Dame for 10 years, really had no plans to sort of change jobs, but the posting came from Princeton, we're looking for a librarian in classics, Hellenic studies, and linguistics. And I had all sorts of people contact me saying that this job has got your name on it. You have to at least, apply and talk to them. And so I did. And so I came to Princeton, and I've been here now 11 years. And I'm probably more of a Byzantinist here than I was even at Notre Dame, simply because a strange confluence of things. We have 5 people on the teaching and research faculty who are in fact Byzantinists. And I'm still counting John Halden, who recently retired, but John is still around. I'm also counting Jack Tanous as a Byzantinist, but there are 5 people. And then there's also the Center for Hellenic Studies here under the leadership of Dimitri Gondakis that provides lots of funding, energy, activity related to Byzantine studies. So this is somewhere where Byzantine studies does in fact happen. In fact, I sometimes describe myself as the Forrest Gump of Byzantine studies as well. I mean, I just keep showing up at places where, this Byzantine studies is happening. So there you have it.
Yeah, you do have a lot of people at Princeton. It's probably the greatest concentration of Byzantinists in North America.
It has to be. It just has to be.
Yes. And so hearing your trajectory as an accidental Byzantinist, I realize that I'm kind of the opposite of that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the way so I'm a very deliberate Byzantinist, and in fact, I won't go on about it, but once I made the switch from physics to history and the humanities and so on, my undergrad degree was in philosophy, actually. We'll talk about philosophy later.
Yeah, sure.
But I made a strategic decision to, how shall I put this, pretend to be a Byzantinist in order to stay in the academy, in order to do philosophy.
Interesting.
And Byzantium was going to be my cover.
Right.
Right. Because I realized, well, this is a fascinating area. It's pretty wide open, given the amount of material that we have from it and the number of people who study it, there's a great imbalance. And so there's a lot of room for original new work.
Absolutely.
And it's the kind of work that I thought I could do, unlike philosophy, which I was you shouldn't be publishing philosophy in your 20s and 30s. So I'll just do Byzantium as a cover. But secretly work on philosophy.
Sure.
Yeah, but then
so you're a true Byzantinist. You're a true Byzantine philosopher.
Yeah. Then I just dropped the philosophy.
Sure.
Yeah. Then I actually became what I was pretending to be. Right. Well, that's one way to put it.
Become what you are, as Nietzsche says, right? Yeah, exactly.
If you keep pretending it after a while. Anyway, that's a whole other story about why I gave up on philosophy. But whatever. So, by the way, did you ever catch up on the theology that you didn't get at Harvard?
Well, I mean, I say that sort of, facetiously. I mean, I loved diff school. And in fact, it just had a very open-ended curriculum. You were able to pursue kind of your own interests. I did a lot of classics while I was at diff school. I focused on languages while I was there, because I think the idea was to use that master's as sort of a preparation for a PhD. But for a variety of reasons, I just didn't have the energy, the concentration, or the talent to go much further. So.
Okay. So for people who don't know what a librarian at Princeton does, one who's in charge of these three areas, like Byzantine studies and classics and Hellenic studies and linguistics and so on. So what exactly do you do? What's your day job?
Yeah. So I'm what's known as a subject librarian or a subject liaison, which means I'm responsible for discrete departments or disciplines within the university. So in the case of Princeton, I'm responsible again for classics, Hellenic studies, which would include Byzantine studies and modern Greek studies, and then also linguistics. And so it's a job that has a lot of varied responsibilities, which I think keeps it, interesting. And there's also a lot of space to kind of create your own style as a librarian, right? There's a lot of space to sort of develop your own interests, develop your own strengths. And so it's a good job. But essentially, there are four areas, I think, when we talk about the duties of a liaison. One would be what's called collection development, where I'm responsible for purchasing the research material in support of these disciplines. And that could be just, direct acquisition or just in consultation with other librarians about acquisition. So that's one. Number two, I'm the public face for these resources, so that I do a lot of research consultations with researchers. I teach classes in large and small groups about how to use the library. I do a lot of troubleshooting for researchers who are having trouble accessing material. So there's a public service aspect to my job as well. That, again, a lot of variety in that. Then I think a third area would be what I would call library service. I mean, I'm a member of a large bureaucracy, so there's a certain amount of committee work. There's a certain amount of collaborative projects that go on within a library. A lot of these now are related to digitization, to the presentation of unique collections, on the web. And so I'm involved in projects of that nature. And then the fourth area, which is I think where I function as a Byzantinist, is this open area where I think a subject librarian is expected, I think, to develop and deepen their subject expertise. So, some of us dabble a bit in research. This is where I spend a lot of time, I think, reading Greek with graduate students, and sort of pursuing my interests and my activities, but primarily as a Byzantinist. And so it's really kind of in those four areas. And again, there's a lot of variety to the job. It's an interesting job.
I imagine that a librarian at Princeton would have, more resources than librarians in many other university libraries.
Absolutely.
Where, a lot of your colleagues are probably having to make some difficult choices, but I'm sure that you do too. So what are some of the difficult choices that you're having to make, or just some of the problems that you're dealing with? This is in your capacity as a librarian. So what are some of the open problems that you're struggling with in those areas?
Yeah, and here's where I probably have to be a little bit careful as a librarian at Princeton, because Princeton is arguably, the richest, research institution for the humanities, I would argue, in the world. I mean, our funding is really like no other in terms of the library, and specifically, say, in the humanities. The per capita spending, the Princeton academic community is not very large, less than 6,000 undergraduates, about 2,000 grad. And so we have problems and issues that other libraries simply do not. And
where to put all your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like, how do I spend all this money? How do I do it, judiciously? How can I be a good steward of these resources? A lot of issues in my area now come down to sort of print and electronic balance. How much do we need that's available electronically? How much do we need to sort of maintain and print? And a lot of libraries, have made that decision 20 years ago that, we're going to go primarily electronic, or, and Princeton is still a place where we buy, multiple formats of the same thing. And so, the challenges at Princeton are different than maybe anywhere.
But don't you have storage problems?
We do. In some sense, Firestone is the main library at Princeton, where a lot of the humanities collections are, and of course it's a very fixed amount of shelf footage. But we also have an enormous storage facility that's not maybe a mile and a half from campus, called Recap. It's a facility that we share with New York Public, Columbia, and now Harvard. And so, we have storage issues, but the storage is close at hand, and it's basically, I mean, in theory, unlimited, but of course,
Sure. We have one of those, and
sure.
It was previous decade, our library was closed for renovations, and you would order things from there. But something you could go there, and I went, and it was vast.
Absolutely.
It's cavernous. In fact, they had little trucks driving down the aisles.
Absolutely.
It was like that scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, it's almost a little disconcerting when ours is similar. When you go out and you see this sort of robotic facility where all of this material is stored, and part of that seems like cool, but part of it is a little disconcerting. I don't know.
Yeah, and I was looking for Cicero's letters, which was just incongruous in the extreme.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, so you mentioned digital projects and digital resources. And I know that you've done a lot with that. For example, you should let our audience know that you made a kind of like a search engine database where people can go online and search for all translations of Byzantine texts that have been done in any modern language. And it's a very useful resource. I know, my students use it all the time. I use it sometimes just to double check. So that's a service to the field that you did there in terms of a digital tool. What other sorts of digital resources are you experimenting with, or where do you think that we can do more with? Yeah,
it's funny, as a librarian, of course, part of my responsibility is sort of staying abreast of online tools and databases and helping in their development. But I'm someone who has a real kind of love-hate relationship with technology. And so there's always this sort of opportunity cost thing that's going on in my head. If I really get involved in a digital initiative, like, it means I'm not doing something else. And so I'm always kind of working that balance. So for instance, the database that you mentioned, the translation database, there's a certain amount of overhead of maintaining a database like that. And I am a one-person shop at this point. But it would seem like an obvious way to sort of help the field is, you well know, is that when you teach Byzantine studies, it's primarily in translation.
Yeah.
The sources are, most of them, in Greek. We can't expect people to kind of access them. So I think that was a kind of a no-brainer, about that database. And I basically maintain it just by being, bibliographically active in the field, but also in every issue of the Byzantinische Zeitschrift, I'll go through and try to get all the translations that are mentioned there. So I'm tracking journals, translations in journals, edited books. But the real problem in terms of the opportunity cost came when I decided to take on a second database. And this one was related to manuscripts. And it began really for my own personal use and interest. When I was at Notre Dame, they had a full microfilm copy of the Ambrosiana manuscript library in Milan. And there were about 1,100 Greek manuscripts on microfilm. And I just loved randomly picking, reels, setting them up and just looking at manuscripts. And it was something I thought I was going to really miss when I came to Princeton. Well, so that was 1,100 on microfilm. The present state of digitization, there are now over 13,000 fully digitized, freely accessible Greek manuscripts. And so it was my intention to create a database that would track just those kinds, just fully digitized and freely accessible. And this has been a real can of worms because it's difficult to kind of stay on top of as manuscripts are added. And I should add, there's a database of record for Greek manuscripts called Penakes, which is maintained in France. And they basically are collecting data on all manuscripts, whether digitized or not. And originally, when I began my database, they weren't tracking the digitization links as well as I would have liked. But they've really caught up. And so my database now is really a kind of complementary one. I mean, the way I use it is when I'm reading an article and I come across a reference to a manuscript, and I know immediately that this is among the manuscripts that have been digitized, my interface allows you to do just a quick search just on the discrete number, and you're immediately on the link. So within a few seconds, I'm able to look at the manuscript. Which is, it's not some radical game changer, but I think it's a new phase in kind of the philology of the field. So I'm happy to maintain that database. Now, I should say in both, and I'm hoping one thing that some of your listeners will do is that, while I try to stay up on both of them, I'm always open to, adding the glaring omissions. So that especially in the translation database, if there are translations that that aren't in there, please email me and I add them immediately. And this happens fairly consistently.
Oh, you do get emails from people saying
absolutely saying you don't have this, you don't have that. I've gotten some very testy emails from Russia about my lack of Russian translation. So if anybody has a handy list of Russian translations, please do send it along.
Yes, they will let you know when you
absolutely,
use the Russian item.
Absolutely. It was not a friendly email.
Yeah, so having these digitized manuscripts is incredible for me. I'm not a paleographer. I don't do editions of text.
Right.
Nevertheless, there are so many occasions when I have either needed to or just wanted to go look at the manuscript.
That's right.
For all kinds of things. So, for example, I remember I came across a reference to a scholion by Arethas.
Right.
Bishop of Caesarea, early 10th century, commissioned these manuscripts.
Absolutely.
And he had a scholion on Clement of Alexandria, which purportedly had the first reference to the word lesbian being used in the modern sense.
Wow. Okay.
That's him.
Yeah.
And I thought, being a lesbian myself, I got to find this. Right. And I did. It wasn't that easy because there was no folio reference. So I just had to go I had to go to Clement's text, find where he talks about this.
That's right.
And then kind of backtrack. So that was very, that was interesting. But I took a photo of it. So now I use it in talks.
Oh, absolutely. And you bring up a good point too. When I say that you're 2 seconds away from looking at a manuscript, once you get there, that's when the fun begins. Because, you got to find now your passage within that manuscript. And that's,
yeah. Another case I remember was I was looking for a cover image for my History of Byzantium in the 10th and 11th centuries, and I thought I would look through Basil II's Menologion.
Sure.
And that I think that's Vatican.
Exactly. Yeah, that's digitized.
And they've digitized the whole thing. It's like almost 500 quote pages of purely sadistic images. Right. It's the harsh. By the end of it, I was just depressed.
Right.
It's almost
the spurting blood in some of these images is amazing.
Yes, so many torture implements and all of this.
Right.
That I was like, oh, Basel, what are you looking at? Anyway, so with all of these digitized manuscripts, you mentioned to me that you're doing some data work. You can use this almost as an archive of big data to start generating conclusions about what the Byzantines are reading and writing when, or at least to form to get a shape of that, just a preliminary shape.
Yeah, and this is, I think, the direction that I want to continue to go with this data. And by the way, I offer the data right at the site as a free download. Anybody can download all the data that I have at my database and start to play with it, because it's a question of, at this point, of metadata, right? Of how do we describe the manuscripts in a way that we can make these sort of aggregate generalizations about the distribution that we see in manuscripts. And it's a tricky business, and I think you have to be careful, about that. But one of the reasons that I like sort of maintaining my quote unquote own database is I'm the person who's assigning the metadata to these manuscripts, and I assign some very generic sort of subject themes to them. Most manuscripts are thematic or the collected works of a single author. Certainly not all. There's lots of manuscripts that have a variety of texts. There's florilegia, obviously. But most manuscripts are basically thematic or of a single author. And so among those, we can make some solid metadata decisions, threshold decisions. This is type A, not type B. And once you've done that, you can start to, look at these distributions and then graph them and hopefully create these kind of snapshots that an undergrad or a graduate student could kind of just have in their head about the distribution. Like, for instance, you can see that in the 11th century, there's this explosion of Ibnazianzis manuscripts. Still nowhere near as many as Chrysostom, but there's this significant increase. You can see that, Euripides tends to be, occurs more often than other tragedians. You see things like that. You see the relationship of, say, Aristotle to Plato. So you can see these larger trends that just might help people situate their mind when they think about, Byzantine text or Byzantine literature. And I don't like to get carried away with the significance of all that, but I think it's something that, I could contribute and might be useful. And so I think that's going to come to the site eventually, is I'm going to have a series of graphs that I feel confident that is showing something significant.
Yeah. So I've heard it described that in the 9th century, the manuscripts tend to be more of, philosophical. In the 10th century, they're more historical and this kind of thing. On
that point specifically is that, we'll talk more about this, the 11th and the 12th century are generally considered as this sort of flourishing of Byzantine letters and the philosophical activity, Michael Psallos in the 11th, and we have this other activity in the 12th. And the assumption would be that we're going to see an uptick in philosophical manuscripts in those centuries, and we don't see it. That we actually see a higher percentage of philosophical manuscripts in the 10th century. And then again, in the 13th and going forward, there you see a very gradual increase. So, and again, it's hard to say, what does that mean? There's probably a million reasons for this that we have to kind of think about, but maybe that's the point. It's something worth thinking about.
Right, because these manuscripts had a very long shelf life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other thing about it is, I have a brother who's a scientist, and this concept of the number of iterations in an experiment. And he's always amazed that you have your N is 13,000. I mean, that's incredible, so I think that, the point being is that we have a lot of data now. We do. And I think that we can probably start to make some of these generalizations. And again, and a lot of these are generally known. I mean, I think we've always known that there's, increased interest in Nazianzus in the 11th century. And, a lot of these things tend to be unknown as well. But there might be some, some hidden gems in there as well.
Sure, sure. And none of this would have been possible without these digital tools.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And
exactly.
The number 13,000, those are the manuscripts that have been digitized and placed online. Am I correct? I have this number in my head that the total number of Byzantine manuscripts that we have is something around 60,000.
I think that's right. I've always thought like between 40 to 60, but I think that's right. I think 60 is closer to it. Yeah. So
yeah,
that is the kind of range that we're at. But I would probably argue, however, though, that the 13,000 we have, again, the N is very high, is a fairly fair representation of these distributions.
Okay.
And I think that, we have major collections that are very diverse that are part of that digitized group.
That's weird because 60,000 is exactly the number of lead seals that we have from Byzantium.
Interesting.
It's an odd coincidence.
Yeah. Right.
All right, let's not go down.
Yeah.
So another digital tool that you are a heavy user of, you told me, is the TLG.
Yeah, the TLG.
And
yeah, I mean, the thing about the TLG, and I will say this: when I started as a Byzantinist, and I'm going to have a couple of stories maybe about the early days of myself as a Byzantinist, is that one of the things that was apparent to me, and is that there was this enormous opportunity like presented to me, remarkably for someone with my interests. I've always been very precocious about language, to all of a sudden be dropped in the lap of Byzantium, because here's a discipline whose literary evidence is vast. It's largely unknown, untranslated, uncommented on. And so a librarian is always looking for an angle about how to gain proximity with researchers and how, in other words, how to best understand how to serve researchers. And I just thought this is the perfect avenue for me. If I concentrate on Greek and on reading Byzantine texts and familiarizing myself with the tools and the resources that address the language of Byzantium. And again, by that, I mean specifically Greek in my case, that this would really be a rewarding and hopefully, valuable contribution as a librarian. And so given that focus, the TLG is, I basically, live in the TLG.
So let me just say for our audience that the TLG
is
the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, and it's an online searchable database of basically all ancient, most Byzantine, and quite a few post-Byzantine texts, Greek texts. So you can go and so wait, what do you do? Do you mean you read texts on there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So what the TLG, and you've accurately described it, and since the late 80s, it's been adding lots and lots of Byzantine texts. And I'd say that, all of, the major authors deep into their holdings are now in the TLG. So a lot of these editions for Byzantine authors are very hard to track down.
Yeah.
And so the TLG, they're all in one place. Now, of course, the TLG has digitized a single edition of those texts, but oftentimes it's the current critical edition. But in many cases, they're older editions. But you at least have immediate access to the Greek of Byzantine texts all in one place. And of course, they're all hyperlinked so that you can move between texts, very, very quickly as well. And so there's that sort of, great value of the TLG. You just have all the text at your fingertips. That's the first thing. And all the words, of course, that you're looking at are hyperlinked to Greek dictionaries. And the TLG has added, there's probably 7 Greek dictionaries that are linked to any word that you see in a text. So in other words, one of the real challenges of Byzantine Greek is that the vocabulary is enormous. And so when you're reading a Byzantine Greek text, I don't care who you are, I've been doing it for 20 years and I'm constantly looking up words. And so to be able to just click on a word and quickly gain access to its definition is critical to really sustaining enough pace to keep a comprehensive contact with the text. So that's critical. But then you have all the search capability in the TLG, where you can search for a particular exact form of a word, or more importantly, now you can search for the lemma of a word. In other words, the morphology of Greek is very, very complicated. And anyone who has taken any Greek knows this. The famous, verb stem iemi. I think there's like 450 possible forms of that one verb stem.
It's more like 139.
It's 139. I don't know where I got 400. Okay, that's going to qualify everything I say from here on out, Anthony. Thanks.
No, I'm joking. It's like only 139.
Yeah, there's only 139. Okay, so there's only 139. Still, it's a pretty big number. The N is very high on that.
Yes.
So the point is you're able to run a search, and all you have to do is enter, the dictionary headword, one form of EAME. That's the exact word, and the TLG is going to find all of the declined forms of that word in a search. And of course, I'm often doing what's known as a proximity search. I'm looking for two words that are relatively close to one another. And so you're finding connections doing that. The TLG has recently added even more functionality, which I think is of great significance for readers of Byzantine text, primarily what's called the engram, which is a kind of an algorithm that's looking for similar passages in text. So what I'll do is I'll call up a Byzantine text, I'll click on engram, and what that algorithm does then, it highlights word strings, 3 or 4, word strings. And given the shading of that highlighting, it tips me off to the fact that there are a few or a lot of similar strings found in the entire corpus of the TLG. So, and in terms of, Byzantine authors who are alluding to other texts a great deal, there's a lot of intertextuality going on. The engram is a fantastic tool. And in fact, when I read with, in a group of graduate students, we generally have somebody who's running the engram as we read and is able then to sort of interject that, okay, well, this is Nazianzis, this is Chrysostom, et cetera. And the engram kind of puts that at your fingertips.
Yeah, it's done some damage, though, in editions of texts.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that. Exactly. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying, you keep running this and you end up with like an apparatus at the bottom of the page that's just flagging dozens of texts as relevant intertexts, and they're not.
I mean, I think there's always been this notion of what, in quotes, TLG scholarship, that the TLG creates this kind of faux scholarship, this sort of shallow scholarship, that you get a few instances of a few words that appear together, and then you make sort of generalizations from that, or you create inflated apparatuses, and this is, and again, it's the tool argument, right? That everyone can misuse a tool, et cetera, and we can talk about that. But I think, again, I'm talking about the TLG as a remarkable tool for accessing very difficult texts that really have no other support. There are no commentaries, there are no translations in many instances, and so this is kind of what we have. And I was going to add that the last feature that has been recently added is that you can now search for words in combination with grammatical categories, and this is really, bringing it into an even deeper philological sort of depth. For instance, you can search for a specific word, say within a 5-word proximity of a verb in the optative,
right?
Which might be, is of interest to philologists. And
let me tell you. So I ran an interesting search yesterday.
Okay, yeah.
So I was wondering, just out of the blue, and my search is in the TLG, so I don't read text on the TLG, but I go in there to solve questions that I have.
Sure.
Especially about the history of words.
Okay.
And because you can arrange the search results chronologically.
Absolutely, exactly.
Right. Now, the dates that they assign to certain texts are more or less, but you get a picture.
Exactly.
And I wanted to trace the history of the suffix Apulos for a name.
Okay.
Because you know how every other Greek is named Papadopoulos?
Right.
So, first of all, what is that?
Right.
And when did it start? And, well, we know what it is. It comes from Latin pulus, which is like a baby bird or a chick.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And it refers to the offspring or child of X, right? Sure. So Papadopoulos is it's a priestling.
Right. Exactly.
Right? It's like duckling.
Right. Okay.
Or deanling. All right. So this is a question about how on earth did a Latin noun
right.
become a suffix for Greek name formation? And I was curious about this because those kinds of names first appear in like, oh, let's say around the year 1000.
Okay.
Okay, so I managed to trace that, but nothing before that. And I figured, yeah, this can't be a contemporary influence. This has to be something that had entered Greek a long time ago, a long time before that. And
Right.
it's only at that point that it kind of worked its way. So it must have been used for animals first, because that's what it was used for in Latin.
Okay.
So like a calf or like the offspring of an animal would be called the animal name Apulos.
Exactly.
Right. But the TLG wouldn't help me with that because it's just not attested, because nobody wrote those kinds of things, even if they were saying them. So where did I go?
Where?
I went to the papyrus database.
Okay, another great one.
Yeah. Like you can access it through papyri.info.
Exactly.
Right? And I searched for Apulos, but using 2 lambdas, because that's how it would have been spelled when it was first transposed from Latin into Greek.
Well done.
And lo and behold, I found a papyrus, 5th century, that refers to peristeropulo, which is and it's in a list of food items. And this is a bird, it's a pigeon. And so it's a baby pigeon. And there it is in Greek.
Well, that must have been fun.
Oh, yes. Because now, I know that term was being used throughout, from the 5th to the 11th century. It's just not used in literary texts, which makes sense, until it appears in names.
Very interesting. Well, you're a craftsman. I mean, you're using the tools well.
Yes, but they're eating pigeons, Dave.
I'll leave that to the historians. I'm just interested in the words, Anthony.
Yes, I have found papyri where they're eating camels.
Wow.
Yes. But anyway, that's the Persian occupation of Egypt in the 7th century. I found these lists of all the food items that they're bringing to the table of the Persian governor, and every Tuesday he had a camel, I think.
Wow. Wow.
Anyway.
I used to go to Taco Bell every Tuesday. I don't know if that's similar, but
I'll take the camel.
But you bring up a good point about the TLG, that it does only include literary texts, right? That papyri, that the Greek in papyri is in fact in another very developed database, which you've described, papyri.info, right?
Yeah. So I wanted to pick up on something else you said, which is that you read a lot of Byzantine texts, and you're one of the few people I've heard admit that he enjoys reading them. Normally, we're not supposed to do this.
Well, right. So I have said that, have I? Okay.
Well, and it's also obvious. You can't hide it.
Yeah, I do, but, and I kind of blame you for this a little bit, because it was either in a conversation or at a talk that I attended that you gave, and I think you've written it as well, where you've posed this question, I think, to the field. Is there anybody out there who actually enjoys reading Byzantine texts? And I think that that's really stuck with me. I mean, I think it was at that point that I really began thinking of it in those terms, because one, it was kind of undeniable. There was something that I did enjoy about reading Byzantine Greek, but I hadn't really specifically thought about it, because like you said, there's almost something, I don't know, maybe transgressive or inappropriate about bringing in kind of your own enjoyment into your interaction, with these texts. But as a librarian, again, I'm sort of I'm near the field. I'm sort of a para-Byzantinist. But it's interesting because, in the word para, like paralegal, is that I'm alongside a Byzantinist. But in the Greek sense of the preposition para, there's also this transgressive idea, right? That you're kind of, there's this, is this kind of a misuse of the academic sense of these texts to sort of bring in too much of your own enjoyment? I don't know. But I think it's true, is that I do enjoy it. And I think for reasons that are probably fairly obvious, when we talk about Byzantine texts or literature, we talk about the Greek language in a sort of continuum of registers, so that there is a kind of high register Greek that is very crafted by professional orators, and then, all the way down to the spoken language, and that there's sort of higher middle registers, lower registers, and that that there was, Byzantine literati could operate in all of these registers, etc. And so when you talk about the text that I enjoy, and it gives you a sense for my own mind, I think, is that I like reading Byzantine prose in the high register because it's such a game. These are so highly crafted. It's as if you're in the presence of hyper literacy, a kind of literacy that we no longer can recognize or are in touch with. And so you become a kind of archaeologist, essentially, of literacy, of trying to figure out how is this operating. When you get a sense for how rigorously someone was trained to pull off Greek in the high register, which is no longer a spoken language, to the people doing it, that all the hours of memorization and declamation and performance and drill over and over again, that there's a kind of a remarkable series of layers that I think are in fact enjoyable. So on one level you have the syntactical complexity, and I think this is where I have a certain highly formalized mind. I'm looking for patterns and for and then in Greek in the high register, it's remarkable the things that they're able to do with syntax. These sort of these inversions of the way sentences are constructed, and as you gain a little bit of familiarity, you start to see those things, and there's a certain pleasure in just identifying them. And then at the semantic level, I mean, a lot of these texts are so opaque on the first read that the first cut is like, is he talking about a horse or a block of cheese? What is the actual object here? What's going on? Yeah. And so there's a pleasure in cracking that nut. And then you you move down the layer, and it's the kind of Greek that sort of keeps on giving. In other words, Byzantine literature these aren't an inventory of supplies from a wine cellar. That these are full-blown literary compositions that are I think have a lot to give for someone with a certain kind of mentality. And then there's a question of genre. There's a criticism of Byzantine literature that it fell into a restricted number of genres, but some of those genres I like a great deal. One is epistolography. We have large letter collections of Byzantine authors. Michael Psolos's would be included here, and a lot of these letters are perfunctory of court intellectuals who are writing to people above them, advancing careers of people below them. But then there's a category of letter where you have two very literate people expressing, I think, a true literary friendship with one another. And I think those letters can be very moving and interesting. And there's a whole series of these. And I particularly like reading those. Then there's the genre of funeral orations, another kind of favorite of mine. For someone who, New York Times, I read the obituaries. It's one of the first things I go to when I'm reading, the Times. And I think funeral orations are also very, very interesting and reveal the sensibility of these authors well. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, kind of the contour of kind of what I like about it.
Sure. So speaking of a lot of these authors are real craftsmen.
Absolutely.
Right. So this is a very, very difficult enterprise of composing these works. They're very deliberate. They're very structured. I agree with you about the syntax. It's kind of all about structure.
Yep.
Have you recently read Gregory of Nazianzis' funeral oration for Basel of Caesarea?
I mean, not recently, but it's a fundamental text.
It's a classic, right?
Yeah.
And I thought one day I assigned it to some of our classics grad students.
Okay.
Just to see how they would.
Yeah.
It was too hard.
Interesting.
For them. But it's one of those texts where you just look at a sentence and it's like, no. And then it falls into place. Got it.
Yep. Absolutely.
But it takes a while. It's like, I see what you did there.
Exactly.
It's really, really something.
Yeah.
And I know exactly what you mean. There's the thrill of sort of cracking the sentence.
Right.
And then the meaning.
Absolutely.
Which is a whole other thing, right?
A whole other thing.
And it's almost like, imagine, just to convey this to the audience, because you don't get these, this exhilaration from a translation. You can't.
Absolutely.
It's like some obscure genre of 18th century music, right? That is heavily crafted and follows all these rules.
Right.
But there's like an infinite number of variations that you can perform within those rules.
Exactly.
And yeah, I mean, if you're like an aficionado of that particular subgenre, then it really works for you.
No, it absolutely does. And I should add as well that this idea of, I do my own personal reading, but, one of the roles that I've been able to inhabit a little bit is reading Greek with other people. I've been, involved in Greek reading groups, since really the early days at Notre Dame. And this is also, I think, part of the pleasure of reading these texts is I like knowing people in the context of a reading group, because, especially a text where there is no translation or commentary, it's just you, a group of people in front of a text, and in the right combination of people, the right kind of, graciousness and curiosity and almost kind of humility, it's a special experience. I know I've shared this anecdote with you, and I share it with everybody. At Dumbarton Oaks, it maintains a page of these oral histories of, the giants in the field. And one of my favorites is by Michael McCormick, the Harvard historian, where he describes being a member of a reading group at Dumbarton Oaks, led by none other than Alexander Kazhdan. Of course, one of the giants of Byzantine literature, wrote many of the entries in the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium. And Alexander Kazhdan led this reading group, and they were reading Psalos because I think, in Kazhdan's mind, this was a very entertaining, interesting author. And in Michael's telling, it's like, how loud the group would get and how funny it was and what a kind of a great time it was. But my favorite part is where he describes Robert Browning, who was also a member of this this reading group, who is a great authority on the history of the Greek language. The way Robert was able to read a sentence with this sort of intonation and cadence that would sort of reveal the syntax. And anyone who's read Greek kind of knows what this means. And Michael describing it as absolutely, absolutely remarkable. And I think I just love that, because that's in some sense what I'm after. That remarkable.
I see. Yeah. It's also very rare. And it's not something our field has invested in cultivating very much. So I should say, just by way of background, that for a long time it was not just customary, but even mandatory to dump on Byzantine literature as something sterile and unoriginal and affected, and now we have to read this. And this is how scholars actually wrote about. Scholars who were experts in it and very good at reading it would describe it that way.
Exactly.
And I still don't know whether this was a genuine dislike, like they were just educated in the modern classics and found this type of literature just to be offensive to their sensibilities, or maybe this was a kind of affect, like you just had to distance yourself from any kind of enjoyment of this to establish some kind of, cred.
Right.
I still can't understand it. And I think we've successfully vanquished that attitude. So nowadays, no one would come out and say anything like that. I
think that's right.
Though, parenthesis. Some Byzantine authors are better than others.
Absolutely.
Right? And there's some I just don't enjoy reading, and there's some who weren't that good at the game.
Exactly.
Right? But by the way, who are some of your favorites to read?
Well, I mean, Salas is clearly number one. From there, I like the Chaniatis brothers, Michael Chaniatis, Nikitas. Sure. I mean, I think that, you're going to get a lot of, bang for your buck there. I like Michael Italicus. I like his letter collection. I enjoy those. And again, I read philosophy. So sometimes even the high register, like, John Idyllis is someone that, I've read a fair amount in. Gregory of Antioch, who, is the era of Eustathius of Thessaloniki in the 12th century. That, those two authors to me are the pinnacle of the high register. Those are the ones that are going to bust your chops every time you try to look at those texts. But again, they're also very, very interesting in I think, rewarding in their way. But again, not to beat a dead horse, I like to come back to Sollas because one of the great things about his Greek in many ways is that it is more accessible than many authors of the high register.
Yes.
At least to me, I'm able to understand him much better, really, even on the first read, especially in a lot of the texts that I particularly like his letters and his theological lectures. He talks about that as well, although, somewhat disingenuously. He writes a letter in the fairly high register asking his correspondent to write in the lower register, implying that you really can't pull off the high register, so stop trying.
Yes.
But I basically read authors of the 11th and the 12th century. I'm a middle Byzantinist in that way.
And so you've written a number of articles and studies on Psellos as a philosopher. Now, we're almost out of time, and I don't know that we can open the question of Byzantine philosophy right now, but
sure.
I am actually thinking of doing some podcast episodes on that topic later on. I'm just thinking about how to organize them. But, you would be one of the people very relevant for this because you've written about his philosophy. So I was just wondering if, by way of conclusion, you can talk a little bit about that. Was Psellos, in your view, a philosopher, and what does that mean to you? Or if you have any thoughts about Byzantine philosophy, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's a pretty open-ended question.
It is pretty open. Yeah, I'm
really any kind of numbers of ways because this idea of Byzantine philosophy. I mean, if you're interested in philosophy, why would you be interested in Byzantine philosophy? Because there's basically a question that it even exists in this overwhelmingly theological context.
Yeah.
And my answer to that is always that, the Byzantines, I think, had two fundamental definitions of philosophy. One was that it related to a monastic, an ascetic who had really achieved a certain level of theosis, right? That this was really a Christian definition of true philosophy. They often call it that, true philosophy. But they also had a very specific understanding of philosophy, as specifically the study of Plato and Aristotle. And there can be no doubt about that. So the question is, were there people in Byzantium studying Plato and Aristotle? And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, there were never very many. I think we have to sort of admit that. It was the highest level of the sort of the Byzantine curriculum. It was,
Right.
It was philosophy with especially reaching Plato. And so there's never very many of those people, but have there ever been very many people engaged with Plato and Aristotle? I mean, I think it's still an open question whether our era is any more or less philosophical than the Byzantine era. So I don't, but I also have a very broad definition of what I think philosophy is. I think if you reach a certain level of abstraction, you're left with a few, ideas. There's a few moves, there's a few things. And whatever your ideas are at that level, I'm kind of okay with that. I tend to be like, Whitehead's little dictum about the history of European philosophy being a series of footnotes to Plato. I mean, I tend to be that kind of mentality that Plato represents for the first time, a density, a depth and a breadth of philosophical issues that our conversation, you can be a current philosopher and be in conversation really with Plato. And I think the Byzantines were, I think Psellos was, and I think I've gotten a lot out of reading Psellos, in a philosophical way. And right, I think if we're at the end of our time, it's too bad we could go into, I think a lot of the specifics. I think in the case of Psellos, he introduces very explicitly the great systematizer of Platonism, the Neoplatonist Proclus, who also is really the source for Pseudo-Dionysius. And Pseudo-Dionysius then sort of feeds the other two main Orthodox intellectuals, theological intellectuals, which would be Maximus the Confessor and Gregory Nazianzus. And Psellos operates, I think he feels that he's fully within, the bounds of orthodoxy by basically saying, look, I'm not saying anything that these three fathers did not say. And I'm also operating strictly within the bounds of nature, that I'm only sort of using Greek philosophy to talk about nature. But here's the last thing I would say about that. And what interests me is that the problem comes is when your conceptualization of nature starts to become very, very similar to the conceptualization of the two fundamental Christian doctrines, which would be the incarnation, the person of Jesus, and then the doctrine of the Trinity. That the structure, the conceptual structure, within Neoplatonism lends itself to these kind of analogous similarities. And I think that's where Byzantine thinkers would get into trouble, is that in speculating or thinking about either the person of Jesus, the issue of Christology, or in terms of the Trinity, they would begin to use metaphors and ideas that were found within Neoplatonism in ways that then began to, make, I think, the authorities of orthodoxy uncomfortable. And I think Sulla certainly experienced that. We have evidence, I think there were monastics that were, I think, constantly snapping at his heels. It appears that he was forced to make public confession of faith twice. So I think that these things did occur.
Yeah. Hearing you now, I'm thinking we really need to have a separate focused discussion about this and open the question of Byzantine philosophy and what we mean by that, because I think there are a number of people who are invested in the question or just curious about it. And it does, I think, call for and require some conceptual clarity, which is
absolutely
your domain here.
Absolutely.
So I'll link to one of your studies of said laws, probably the one that you did for the Cambridge history and the Cambridge intellectual history. And let's defer that for another time.
Sure.
I'm trying to get Michela into the discussion. We can.
Yeah. No. There's better authorities than me on Byzantine philosophy. Michela would be certainly one of them.
So, you mentioned obituaries earlier. I read a joke this morning, so I just got to tell you.
Okay, good.
So there's a guy. This is in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Every day he goes to the kiosk and he buys a copy of Pravda. He gets the copy, looks at the front page, just throws it in the trash.
Right.
Next day, same thing. Looks at the front page, throws it in the trash. He keeps doing this. And the guy at the kiosk says, "Hey man, look, why are you just looking at the front page and throwing?" He says, "What are you doing here?"
Right.
He says, "I'm just looking for an obituary." The guy says, "The obituaries are not on the front page." This one will be.
Good.
Anyway, I got a little book of Soviet jokes. I read a few every day.
Good.
All right, Dave. Thank you very much.
Well, sure, Anthony. It's been fun. Thanks for having me on.
It was a pleasure. I wanted people to get some insight into what you do because it's so important for the work of everyone else. Certainly for all the lucky people at Princeton who get to have reading circles with you, but also for us. And I've benefited a lot from you. So thank you again.
Super. Thank you.